All right. I think we'll get going. Anyone who's still trickling in, they'll catch up. So welcome everyone to the virtual field day on grazing hosted by Washtenaw County Conservation District and Michigan State University. My name is Nick Mashinsky. I'm going to be your host today, and we're going to visit Baseline Farm in just a little bit. So instructions for all of this webinar stuff. We're all learning it, so let's have a refresher. You'll all be muted for the presentation. We're starting right now. Audio is through your speakers or headset. If you can't hear me right now, you may want to adjust your settings, and there is an audio setting option to do a sound check as well. During the webinar, if you for some reason cannot hear or anything, ask the help desk. You can send messages or chat to participants down below. But if you have a question, I ask that you use the Q&A button. It's just easier for us to find questions. Otherwise, if you put them in chat, we sometimes have to scroll up to try to find them. So please use the Q&A button. Thank you very much. Again, you'll all be muted. If you have any difficulties, you can also text questions to Megan, 989-666-3773. And again, there's a help desk there for any technical issues. There will be designated times when the chat will be turned on, and you can share your thoughts to all participants as well as panelists, so you'll be able to ask the questions. We just ask that they're appropriate, and we'll address them accordingly. There's going to be polls as well after certain sections, so please keep an eye out for those. It's just a regular statement. And we have today's panelists. Again, I'm your host, Nick Mashinsky of the Washtenaw County Conservation District. We'll have John Cox of Baseline Farm tell us a little bit about his operation. Adam Shedd of Sustainable Ag Solutions take us through Grazing Management Plan. Boyd Bialik of the Natural Resource Conservation Service describing programs. Then we'll have Cable Thurlow of Michigan State University, Paul Gross, and Jason Roundtree, all of MSU, dispelling their information and expertise as well. So with that, let's get going with the presentations.
Once again, everyone, I'm Nick Mashinsky. I'm a meat technician for the Washtenaw County Conservation District. And today I'm going to discuss conservation districts a little bit, as well as what I do as part of the meat program. So what is a conservation district? Well, to answer that, we have to go back to the 1930s to discuss the Dust Bowl a bit, because conservation districts are very much a product of that era. So the Dust Bowl was caused by two factors: the severe drought that lasted about a decade, as well as unsustainable tillage practices. The combination of the two created a very arid landscape, and wind would come by and just pick up all this topsoil and dust and create these storms, which you see on this slide. Now, these storms could push dust and soil from the middle of the country all the way to the eastern seaboard. Now, President Franklin Roosevelt pushed for the Standard State Soil Conservation Districts Act, and that established local conservation districts that would help assist landowners financially. Nowadays, conservation districts tend to provide advice and expertise on certain conservation practices, and districts often reflect the community which they serve. So their services can vary. So, for example, more north in the state of Michigan, you'll have forestry, there's food safety technicians, water quality personnel, but districts also tend to be a gateway to certain cost share programs. It's the 73rd year for the Washtenaw County Conservation District. Districts used to receive support from the state, but that hasn't really happened in the past few years. So Fortunately for us, we had a millage passed by our county voters in early August, and that's going to allow us to expand and better serve the community. Currently, we serve residents through our tree sale and native plant expo, which you see on this slide. We also do well water testing events. In this slide, we teamed up with students from Eastern Michigan University to hold a day where the community could come in with their well water sample, and the students would run certain tests on them. And then, of course, we also have the MAEAP program, which I am a part of. And so I'll explain a little bit about what that is now. So the Michigan Agricultural Environmental Assurance Program, or MAEAP. The program began in 1998 and was made into law by Governor Snyder in 2011. And what it really is an environmental audit to make sure farmers are following the GAMPs, or the Generally Accepted Agricultural Management Practices. Now, the program itself is completely voluntary, so it's not like it's a law that all farmers in the state must go through the MAEAP program. Farmers who are really interested as to how they can improve their operation in terms of their impact on the environment, they're the ones that are really interested in this program. And they also like the confidentiality of the program as well. No one will know that you're going through the MAEAP process unless you want them to know. I don't tell anyone that you're involved. And as I said, it's voluntary. So if there is a point in which you're like, you know what, I'm going to stop this program for now, I've got to work on other things, or it's not really for me, that's completely fine. It's your prerogative. I'm happy to assist you if you decide to change your mind. So there are several steps for the MAEAP program. The first is an educational component, or phase 1 event. Typically that's an in-person field day. Obviously, with everything happening, that did not occur this year. This is our 2019 field event at Green Things Farm, so that counted as an educational component for MAEAP. You can also earn credit by watching videos on the MAEAP.org website. However, you are all going to receive credit at the end of today for attending this virtual event. You'll have a form, you'll fill it out, and you'll send it back to me or your local technician, and you'll receive credit and thus complete the first step of the MAEAP process. The second step is a technician visit. So someone like myself will come out to your farm, you'll give me a quick tour, I'll get a lay of the land. I'm basically there to be an extra set of eyes, maybe pick up on something that you don't see because you pass it every day. I'll ask some questions about your operation and how it relates to the GAMPs. And finally, if I do find any environmental concerns, I'm not just going to hand you a list and say, here you go, good luck. I'm going to work with you to address those concerns, whether it be get you into a cost share program to fix a fueling situation, or simply moving a manure pile a little bit back from any water bodies. I'm going to work with you. The third step is a verifier visit and verification. Once we've addressed all the environmental concerns on your farm, we'll bring out the verifier, and really it's like a technician visit, but this time it counts. They're checking my work, they're making sure we didn't overlook anything, that all environmental concerns have been addressed, and if everything checks out, you'll receive a sign and note and recognition from the state, just like Beacon Springs Farm did here. Now, MAEAP breaks farms into basically four different systems: cropping, farmstead, habitat, and livestock. And you can receive verification in more than one system. So you could receive just a verification in your cropping system, for example, but still be working towards verification in your farmstead system. Baseline Farm is verified in three systems: cropping, farmstead, and livestock. And to give you a little bit of an idea of the questions I ask, and more specifically what I'm looking for during a visit, let's go to Baseline Farm. I'm here at Baseline Farms to discuss the MAEAP program a little bit.
Now, MAEAP, you can get verified in several systems. Two of them here are farmstead and livestock. And I know this is a grazing school, but I thought since everyone tends to have a farmstead and we're obviously at a livestock facility, I'd go into this to these systems in a little bit of detail. One of the things I look for first when I'm at a farm is the well. I look at where it's located in relation to livestock lots, manure piles, pesticides, and other fertilizers. Here, we're a good 150 feet away from any sort of possible contamination. One thing I also ask producers to do is to get a well test, including a bacteria and nitrates and nitrites test. The last thing I'll check is the well cap and to make sure that the screen underneath the cap is secured. Now, fuel also needs to be set back from the wellhead or any other water bodies around the farmstead area. Now, at Baseline Farms, we were concerned that there might be an underground fuel tank here. Turns out, though, after a little bit of digging, this turns out to be just a little bit of decoration. Now, underground tanks are okay for MAEAP as long as they have the proper monitoring system associated with them. So if you have underground fuel tanks, don't be concerned. You just need to work with your MAEAP tech and they can help you get verified with those tanks. So Baseline Farms stores their fuel in this shed, which has no drains or cracks, allowing for no fuel leakage into the groundwater. Now, a lot of farms have fuel tanks, which are also acceptable, as long as they don't have any leaks, they're stably mounted, and they're at least 50 feet away from any well. They could possibly have other secondary containment. Anything over 1,100 gallons will need a secondary containment. Another thing I'll look for when coming out to your farm is where the hay or supplemental feed is stored. Here at Baseline Farms, we have it out in the open. As long as he changes the location of the hay storage every year, that's all right. And as long as it's not on any sandy soils or near any surface water where nutrients can leach or run off into. A barn is also a great place to store hay. And if the hay is wrapped in plastic, that is also acceptable. In terms of manure management, I'm looking for the pile to be, again, set off from any water bodies or any wells. Here at Baseline Farms, manure used to be stored in this low-lying area, which occasionally flooded. But now that the livestock are mainly on pasture, there's very little manure that is actually stored. But if you do spread manure on your ground, then we want you to take soil samples and even a manure test so you know exactly what you're applying to your fields and you can be sure that they're getting the correct amount of nutrients. Finally, I'm looking at pasture management. What are the soil levels here at the farm? How are the pastures grazed? I'm looking to see if there are any bare spots in the pasture because that's where nutrients could build up and eventually leach or run off into water bodies. As you'll soon see, Baseline Farms does an excellent job at managing its pastures. Okay, and now we're going to go over to John Cox of Baseline Farm, where he's going to discuss a little bit more about his operation. So, John, take it away.
My name is John Cox, and I call this Baseline Farm. It's me and the farm, and about 170 cattle at this point. Grazing area is close to 200 acres. The total farm size is about 260. I've been here 4 years, 4 growing seasons now, and we've grown quite a bit. I brought with me about 30 head of cattle total, and bought a few more, but in general, they've reproduced, and I've been selling steers as grass-fed beef, but we've also retained all the heifers that have been born. So just kind of keeping growing and you know, learning how animals turn out and genetics-wise. It's totally a grass-fed operation. We graze all grazing seasons starting in April some point when the grass is just about tall enough, all the way through as long as the grass lasts, which, you know, I'd like that to be into December, but where we're at with fertility and just getting things established, it might only be October or November at this stage. And otherwise, I'll make up the difference by buying hay and feeding hay during the winter season. And I view that as a kind of a fertilizer purchase in a lot of ways. Try to not buy the fanciest hay I can find, but look all around, buy from local guys, go down to the auction and buy what I can afford. And the cattle winter outside and spend the whole year outside. We move every day, at least once a day, and during the growing season, sometimes as much as 2 or 3 times a day, using a lot of temporary fencing, polywire, and reels to keep it organized and manageable. Watering system, we've got a pretty good well here, nothing fancy, but I've created a pipeline on top of the ground out of poly pipe, and there's a bunch of water points throughout the pastures where you can hook in a water trough, 100 gallon or something like that, and give water in every paddock. I don't have a background in farming. I grew up kind of in the suburbs of Fenton, Michigan, and went to college, got an engineering degree in mechanical engineering, and did that in the automotive industry. You know, worked for a number of years, and then kind of just went off and decided to give farming a try. I did some internships and learned pretty quick, and then kind of just jumped into it. So here I am trying to make a go of it. And it's been a lot to learn, not just about the animals, but a lot there, but about how soil works and plants grow and everything in that regard. Not to mention equipment and the things you might need to move things around, move hay around, move cattle around.
All right, thank you very much, John, for sharing your operation. If you have any questions for either myself or for John or any of our next 2 speakers, please use that Q&A button and ask them there. We'll be pausing after in a couple speakers to answer some of the questions. So next we're gonna hear from Adam Shedd, owner of Sustainable Ag Solutions, LLC, and he's gonna discuss a little bit about grazing management plans. So Adam, take it away.
Hi, my name is Adam Shedd. I am the owner of Sustainable Ag Solutions, an agricultural consulting company that I started in 2015 after working for NRCS for 7 years. And today I'm going to be talking about prescribed grazing plans. There are many benefits to having a prescribed grazing plan developed. These include increasing the length of the grazing season, which can help lower feed costs. A lot of times the farms can go from grazing 4 to 5 months a year to 6+ months a year, starting in April and going well through December. This helps to increase the human efficiency on the farms by allowing the livestock to feed themselves versus having to feed them through the winter or dry periods. This can be accomplished a lot of times by grazing cover crops or stockpiling forages, as well as planting and grazing annual forage crops and even crop fodder. This in turn helps to increase profitability, also improves soil and water health on the farm by increasing the diversity of forages on the farm as well as yield. And the plan can also be used as a stepping stone planning document as the farm grows and moves into the future.
What all is included in the plan? Well, there's a beginning section that's includes the introduction with operations goals, and future plans, and what we're trying to accomplish with the grazing plan. Next is a livestock and forage inventory balance, where we record the number of animals and the number of acres needed, along with yields, to balance the number of livestock against the available forage.
It also includes a manure and nutrient management section where soil tests are taken into account, as well as the amount of nutrients available from the manure or any additional commercial fertilizer needed to balance the system. There's a section on watering systems where we design and lay out wells, pipelines, watering facilities, whatever's required for the plan. A fencing section discusses the types of fencing, perimeter fencing, paddock fencing, a design layout of that, feet required. It goes into detail on what's needed for the fencing. A prescribed grazing schedule that talks about average rotation periods, lengths, and how that changes throughout the year. A monitoring plan where the forages are monitored for improvement or any kind of problems and how to go about correcting those. A winter management talks about the feeding through the winter, whether that's grazing on cover crops or crop fodder or feeding bales, whatever the case may be there. What needs to be done during drought or excess water times, flooding, that type of thing, whether that's speeding up the rotation if foragers are getting short, or slowing them down, or even putting them in a sacrifice paddock to feed the animals until the forage conditions improve. A lot of times we'll include a wildlife section. Producers are a lot of times hunters or like to see the wildlife out there, so we take that into account with the improved forages and rest periods that also benefit different types of wildlife. And then at the end, there is a practice implementation schedule. That has the different practices like the fence and pipeline, watering systems, that type of stuff, implementation dates, as well as amounts. In the plan too is the grazing plan layout maps. It has a overview of how things are going to get laid out, where everything's going, and then implementation job sheets, including fence designs and those types of things, and then record keeping forms at the end.
The steps of developing a prescribed grazing plan include a phone consultation to start, where we collect any kind of preliminary information as well as create a to-do list for the producer. A lot of times this can include updating soil tests or jotting down information of how they want things laid out and the direction that they want the farm to go into the future. The next step is a farm visit, where I will come out and meet with the farmer. We'll discuss the current status, take an inventory of what they have there, forages, yields, livestock inventory, and then look around to see what kind of resources they have and any potential problems that we need to fix out there, and then create some preliminary layouts. This is followed up by going back to the office, running numbers on stocking densities, creating paddock sizing, forage mix designs, watering systems, fence layouts, and then putting this all together into the final plan, where we'll go back out for the final farm visit and go through the plan. Final farm visit a lot of times will also include NRCS and a meat technician if they're looking for cost share or looking to get the farm meat verified.
Once we have developed a plan that is going to work for the producer, the next phase is implementation. Most of the time this will include seeking financial help. A completed prescribed grazing plan provides a turnkey blueprint for putting into an EQIP application. We help the producer through the application process as well as contract implementation if funded, and also make any necessary revisions and changes with future changes in the farming operation itself. I would like to thank everybody for listening today and have included my contact information and a link to the website in case anybody has any further questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Adam, for sharing all that information with us. Grazing management plans are a great way, everyone, to sort of get an idea of how you can really improve your operation. It sets you kind of on the right path, I think. Now we're going to go to Boyd Bialik, He's going to help us learn more about the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and more specifically, the EQIP program. So Boyd, let's turn it over to you.
All right. So yeah, today I'm going to just spend a few minutes discussing with you a few of the conservation programs that are available for folks that are either interested in grazing or already in a grazing operation. Particularly, I want to talk about 3 different programs: the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP, the Conservation Stewardship Program, CSP, and then the Conservation Reserve Program for Grasslands, which is kind of a newer one, CRPG. The first 2 are administered by the Natural Resources Conservation Service, who I work for. The third one is administered by the Farm Service Agency, who we work hand in hand with all the time. They have a lot in common. They're all voluntary programs. You choose to participate and get either technical or financial assistance. They each offer a suite of conservation practices to help you meet your objectives. And they each have their own set of incentives that will help you kind of get the wheels turning with your grazing operation. So which one or ones are the best fit for you? Well, that depends. Where are you now? Where are you headed? You know, what you see in front of you here is kind of what I call the grazing continuum. Off to the left, maybe you have just a few animals around, or you're thinking about getting into a grazing operation, but really not much more than that. You move to the middle, now you're doing a little bit more. You know, maybe you're moving your animals once a week, you've got some experience with it. And then when you get to the far right, now you've got more experience, more deeply invested in it. And, you know, the kind of what I say, it's off to the left, you just have some animals. If you're in the middle, you like them. And by the time you get to the right, you love them. You're spending time with them every day. You're giving them fresh groceries every day. From a conservation practice and kind of programmatic standpoint too, if you're off to the left, that's kind of the land of greatest conservation opportunity, where the programs, you know, can really help you get things rolling. And then when you're over to the right-hand side, now you're in the land of kind of the greatest return on your conservation investment. You're starting to reap the benefits of what you're doing conservation-wise. So what's it take to get from left to right, from one side to the other? Well, that depends on your objectives, on your goals. You can see a laundry list here of what some of those might be, but by kind of knowing what you're thinking helps us better align, you know, the best program for you. And so, you know, how much pondering have you done? You know, kind of where are you at in terms of what you think your needs are? And that will help better match the programs to you. So first I'll talk about the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP. And that's really the workhorse program that we have across the whole country. It's probably responsible for 80 to 85% of all the conservation practices that you see out there happening on the ground. It functions really in 2 primary ways. One, there are practices that help with developing the infrastructure of a grazing operation or grazing system. And then once that's in place, it then offers management practices where you're actually applying things to the land. So I'll mention just a few of the structural or physical practices that EQIP can help with. As you see here in the slide, water developments, stock water pipelines, fencing, animal walkways and stream crossings. Those are just a few examples that relate to grazing systems that EQIP can help put the wheels on for you. Maybe it's new seedings or cover crops, forage plantings, things that help you improve your forage base or extend the grazing season. EQIP can help with that. In a lot of cases, brush management is also fairly common through EQIP. A lot of grazing lands over time, for a number of reasons, have seen increases in invasive species, particularly woody ones. And so EQIP can help you get rid of those guys. And then once those things are done, the infrastructure's in place and things are set up sort of the way you like, now the management practices would kick in through EQIP. You know, Adam talked about prescribed grazing, and you know, that's the biggest one that we're all driving towards, I think, or have in our objectives. And basically what we're doing there is balancing available forage with animal numbers. And you know, all of these practices have incentives that through EQIP that will pay, you know, 50 to upwards of 80% of the cost if you're able to get into the program. For prescribed grazing, it can vary anywhere from $30 to $60+ an acre for 3 years once everything's set up and you're rolling forward. So there's some nice incentives to help you get these things done. Nutrient management is another example of a management practice, again, based on soil test results and production goals. Are additional nutrients needed? And if so, then there are some financial incentives to help with that. And I want to just show you one case example here of an operation with lots of EQIP practices already installed in place. The picture is a little bit loud, but if you maybe you can see my cursor, maybe not, but there are some livestock pipelines that give us water tank and water sources that are closer for the animals to travel to. We've got lots of fencing, lots of cross fences. Further to the west, you see a forage planting done through EQIP, all to improve the whole, you know, grazing system and operation. So just to illustrate kind of an example of a lot of these different practices in place on one operation and what that might look like. Shifting gears, I'll talk just briefly about the Conservation Stewardship Program. This one, when it first came out years ago, had the saying went, reward the best, motivate the rest. And what that was all about is with the stewardship program, your existing level of conservation is evaluated. And then there are additional activities that will help you take your conservation efforts to an even higher level that you can choose to do. And those things combined also can result in some financial incentives. Here's a couple of examples. On the left-hand side, you see some monitoring activities of forage. On the right, some forage quality analysis, which can be done through this program. Also stockpiling forage. A couple of soil health examples are things that would improve organic matter or reduce compaction. So again, it's taken your current level of conservation, you've kind of done what you can through EQIP, and now the stewardship program is there to take things to an even higher level. The third one I want to talk just briefly about is the Conservation Reserve Program for Grasslands, which again is administered by the Farm Service Agency, but we assist with that. What you see here illustrated, I spent much of August and September in the Eastern Upper Peninsula working with producers in Chippewa and Mackinac counties on their grazing system and making improvements. Typical scenario, trefoil, timothy. And again, what we're able to do through that program is divide those pastures or create smaller pastures, put in water developments, put in a well if needed, and provide opportunities for rest recovery in our systems up there. So, what are some of the outcomes of these programs? All three of them have some similar outcomes and similar, you might say, requirements, I guess, but really it's coming up with a good balance between available forage supply and animal demand, and kind of fine tuning that to make sure the system, we're not overextending things. All three of them provide adequate rest recovery periods. We shoot for 30 days, and that means basically a minimum of 4 pastures in any grazing system. And what we're talking about there, yeah, in some places, maybe you only need 14 days of rest early on, but later on you may need 45. And so we design them kind of based around 30 days. And then we're looking at always maintaining a minimum critical stubble height of 4 inches in our pastures. And also making sure we have adequate water, trying to get it within 800 or 900 feet of where the animals are. And then we believe that collectively these things will provide or help provide greater economic and ecological sustainability for the producers that are out there on the land. So if you have more questions or looking for more information, contact your local USDA service center, and they'll have information on each of these programs. And they also would have technical information on what to do and how to do it. Thank you for having me here today.
Awesome. Thanks, Boyd, for making it today and for giving us some more information about NRCS and the EQIP program. Now, I believe we have a poll that we're going to put up. This is my poll for MAEAP, so I'd appreciate it if you could answer those questions. We'll give you a few minutes, and then we'll work on answering some of your questions. So we got about half a dozen questions in the box. I saw there were plenty of comments on John's operation. You know, good job. Glad to see a fellow engineer who made their way into farming. Beautiful farm. Yeah, I wish we could have it actually out there today. It's honestly very beautiful out there. So let's see. Our first question is for John. How does John water his cattle in the winter if they are outside? So John.
Yes, that's definitely one thing that we get around. There's a waterer on the side of the barn, a Ritchie waterer 2-holer, and it's not electrically heated. It works great. There's different styles out there, but it's basically a big plastic reservoir for water with a float valve built into it, and it uses ground heat to kind of keep the water from freezing. And you've got to have a certain number of cattle drinking, otherwise it could freeze up when it's well below zero. But yeah, simple solution is to have a frost-free water point at some point. Part of the NRCS water line system that we're going to install next year includes frost-free waters out in the field, so that the cattle don't have to walk all the way back to the barn to get water in the winter time. So yeah.
Excellent. Now don't go anywhere because we have another question for you. When John moves his cattle daily, does that mean from one acre to another? How many animals per acre?
Yeah, that's the question. You can figure it out. You know, when I was just getting started, I did the calculations, and you look at how many animals you have and what are their weights. So you can kind of do an estimate. I didn't weigh them. But knowing that a cow weighs 1,000 some pounds, it'll depend, but you can kind of guess accurately. Add up your total animal live weight, and then usually there's numbers for typical consumption, 2.5%, maybe 3% dry matter, dry matter percentage by body weight. So you've got your total animal weight times 2.5%. That's how many pounds of dry matter forage they're going to need. Well, how many do you have out in the field? You use your NRCS grazing stick. I've got one right here. So basically it's a ruler, but the numbers on the side are what you want. It can give you an estimate for tons of dry matter per inch of forage. And no, you're not going to eat 100% of the forage. So take 50% of what you think you have, come up with a number for dry matter per acre, and then figure out how many acres you need based on how much dry matter you need. You get a feel for it after time. From my case, early in the spring, could be 5 acres a day, 10 acres a day. When the summer growth is really on, it's really thick, maybe they only get an acre a day. It's pretty rough because it depends on how well that acre of ground is growing the forage too.
Excellent. So we got a soil test question here. What is the best soil test and technique? How deep for a soil sample on grazing land? And is there a best test for the content? Cable, I don't know if you want to answer this, or maybe Paul. I know when I do soil tests, I tend to go about 9 inches into the pasture because I want to make sure I get to the root system, but maybe there's some more information or a better way that you could describe for us.
I'm going to hand that over to Mr. Gross. We actually just covered that last evening in our grazing school. So, Paul.
Well, I would agree with you, Nick. I would, typically we like to go, sometimes we call it plow depth. So usually it's a 6 to 8, 8 to 9 inches. So you get that really good profile. And I think that the important thing of when you're taking soil tests is to make sure you get a good random sample of the area. Take a number of probes. I think that's important. Otherwise, if you take a lot of probes in one area, that may skew the overall. Typically the MSU soil test, we'd like you to take at least one test per 20 acres, and that means that 20 acres you'll take 15 to 20 cores out of that 20 acres. But it just depends on the size of your paddock pastures. As far as the best soil test, I think for starting off, I would just do a standard test. Primarily to know where your lime your pH is at in case you need lime. To me, that's very important. That's the first nutrient in my mind that you buy to get your pH corrected, so you get good nutrient utilization of what's out there. Get your P and your K. You get your CEC. The basic test is the one I start off with, and then as you learn and want to get more information, we can start utilizing other tests, even go as far as some of the soil health tests. But just a standard test, that 8 to 9 inches deep. And again, make sure you get a real random sampling of the area you're testing.
One thing to add to that too is if there's been an area where the livestock have been fed for a long time, or watering facilities or something like that, to separate those areas out separately so you're not throwing off the rest of the sample with high nutrient content.
Yeah, that will definitely skew results.
Nick,
I'm gonna.
Can we quick just bounce back to the how many or how often and how much land does he give when he moves? And John hit that perfect. He's a seasoned farmer, a seasoned grazer doing this. One thing that I really want people to keep in mind, especially if you're a beginner, is remember these systems are flexible. We have temporary fencing. We have temporary water systems that can move around because of flexibility. And it's going to depend on a lot of factors. Don't get locked into a system right off the bat. And I have farmers that want to do this when they transition to rotation. They're going to have set size paddocks and they're going to move every so many days, and they want to lay the whole thing out in the spring of the year. And that's impossible to do because of so many factors that were already covered. You know, forage, how many animals, you know, you don't know how much rain you're going to get in a year. So just remember to keep flexibility in the system.
Yeah, everyone, it's good to remember that plans are meant to change. You know, they're ideal, but obviously things occur. Next question. Congratulations, John. Very inspiring. Have you considered integrating timber or fruit tree species into your pastures in order to establish a silvopastoral system and provide additional benefits to cattle and produce additional on-farm products?
Yeah, definitely. I've planted a number of trees, and protecting them is a little bit tricky. Not only do you have natural predators like deer that'll browse them, and voles and other rodents that'll girdle them by chewing on the bark in the wintertime. So I plant a lot of trees, and some of them have survived. But yeah, I think it's a good idea. You just got to really think about how you're going to protect them. I've done it a lot of different ways. Generally, a plastic tree tube seems to work pretty good. At least it keeps the first 4 feet protected from deer, and they might browse off the top of that. Some of them I've just put T-posts and barbed wire around, and that seems to be working. I'm a little concerned cattle will rub on them if they're out there in the winter for an extended period of time, but so far so good. You can use your temporary electric fence, the polywire, to fence off a whole block, and I've done that for kind of a little apple orchard that I'm trying to get going. And yeah, it's a good idea. I don't know how economical it'll be. Like, you might think, oh, you're going to have these apple trees out here and pick and sell apples. Well, that's a nice idea, but I definitely see the value of having a lot of trees. We're fortunate that there are a lot of mature existing trees in the fence rows and even in the middle of the fields. So trees are a good thing. Yeah.
Yeah, you'll have that additional labor of picking the fruit and everything as well. So definitely something to consider. We'll try to get through a few more questions. If we don't get through all of the ones listed here, we'll be sure to hit them towards the end of the presentation. So don't worry if your question wasn't asked. Next one, we want to put a new off-grid water well on our grazing land. What is out there? Who has done it? It needs to work in Michigan winters, of course. So, Cable, what do you think you can tackle that question?
I can speak to it a little bit just because I've thought about that.
Okay.
Yeah, if you're going to have a solar powered well, it's going to take quite a bit of power. You know, look at what a typical well pump runs as far as horsepower, half horse or something. It's doable, and don't think it would be too bad. You could potentially have like a well pit with your pressure tank in it, buried in basically a septic tank type of concrete buried structure. Yeah, it's doable, but not economical for certain situations, I don't think.
We did a lot out in Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. In fact, that oftentimes was your only power source because things are so remote. And it didn't seem to take a very big grid of panels to be able to, you know, move water up from pretty, 800,000 feet down. And then from there, it would just gravity flow everything. So it's something to think about.
Yeah, I imagine it really depends on how big your pastures are, how much land you have to cover with that system. And, Michigan winters aren't exactly the sunniest times of the year, but if you don't need a lot of sun to power that, then it sounds doable. Okay, I think we're gonna stop the questions for now. We'll get to the rest of these towards the end of the session. So again, Don't worry if we didn't ask your question at this moment. We're going to hop back into some presentations in a second. I believe there's a poll we have right before we get into Cable's talk. There we go. So take a few minutes, please, and answer that question or those questions. Okay, I think we'll wrap up the poll there, and let's join Cable out in the field.
My name is Cable Thurlow, and I'm an MSU Extension beef and grazing educator, and I'm here today on the Baseline Farm with farmer John Cox, and we're going to talk a little bit about grazing management today. There's three things really that I think about when it comes to grazing management, and that's the grazing system that you choose, whether it's a continuous system or whether it's a rotational system. And we could talk for days about the benefits of, in my opinion, rotational grazing. The other thing that we'd like to talk about and that's critical is the watering system. So we'll have John talk a little bit about the watering system that he's got here today. And we also want to talk about fencing, and we have some fencing material, portable fencing material here in front of us today, just to give you an example of what it is that we're talking about. So John, we're out here in the pasture. You moved these cattle a little while ago. You were setting up temporary fence using this poly wire here in front of us and these step-in posts that you've got in front of you. Can you tell us a little bit about how you determine what size of paddock you use for these cattle?
Yeah,
so kind of how you allocate pasture?
It's a learning process for sure. And, you know, it started out when I got started 4 or 5 years ago, kind of academically. Like, you can look at your grazing stick or take an estimate of how much forage you've got per acre, tons per acre, and look at your herd size and how much, you know, they're going to eat based on how big your animals are. And then you kind of just pace off a distance. Say you need an acre or an acre and a half. You know, you go 209 feet and then 209 feet, and then there's an acre, square acre.
And that, John, that's the science part of it that we like to say, right?
That's the idea, and I did do that a few times, but in general, you just get a feel for it. You look at how much grass you think you have, and you know how many cattle you have, and you set up an area and then see how they do. These days, I'll move at least once a day, but more often 2, even 3 times a day. And when I say move, that means give them some new area. You don't need to totally move from one spot to another and set up a back fence to keep them out of the old area. They'll stay out of there on their own if they've got good stuff ahead of them. So it comes with a feel for it, and you just watch their performance as well.
You've mentioned a couple of key things, and one of the things that I also encourage producers to think about when they're doing rotational grazing is you know, coming back and evaluating those cattle after you've made those moves. Yeah, you use all the tools that you have available to determine A, how much forage you have in a location, and B, you know how many animals you have, and you have to have an idea of the weight of those animals. And from those two knowns, we can estimate how much forage they're going to use, and that's how you determine your paddock size. And then you come back that next day and evaluate, which is the art part of it. Did I give them enough, or are they standing up and running to the gate when I come there, and are they looking for more, or are they laying down chewing their cuds? So those are some of the simple things that we use to determine whether we're giving them enough pasture. You've got to know the amount of forage that you have available and the approximate live weight of the animals that you have that you're moving, and then, yeah, you move them. You mentioned something critical. When you're moving 2 or 3 times a day, Okay, one of the reasons that we want to do rotational grazing over continuous grazing is to increase the efficiency of the harvest. That system will allow you to go from, in a continuous system, 30 to 40% grazing efficiency to management intensive system like you're talking about here today, upwards of 70% and greater. So that's one of the huge advantages of using rotational grazing over a continuous grazing system. And the back fence isn't needed when you're moving that often because it takes several days before that plant starts to regrow.
Mm-hmm.
You want to have them off there in 3 or 4 days, but if it's just a day or two, you don't need the back fence. You're absolutely right there because that regrowth doesn't start until 3 or 4 days after you've moved them animals off there. And again, rest and recovery are huge with rotational grazing. Alan Williams probably says it best, but you're in an area like this, you graze it, and then you get off and you let it recover, and then you can come back and graze it again, and that's where you get that efficiency. So can you tell us a little bit about the fencing that you use here? I've got a post.
Yep.
Can you tell us a little bit about that fencing?
Yeah, I've learned a lot by doing it a lot. For the actual fence, you need an electric wire. I do. So this is poly wire, they call it. It's poly plastic twine or braided rope. There's metal filaments in there that are conductive, stainless steel and sometimes copper, and you energize this through some type of energizer. It could be battery powered, solar battery powered, could be plugged into the wall. Lots of options there, as long as you have one that's powerful enough with a good enough grounding system. I've had pretty good luck with it. This reel has a gearing mechanism. So when you rotate the handle, you'll get 3 rotations of the bobbin. And that's important because you're going to be reeling this up and unreeling it quite a bit, but reeling it all back up eventually. And with a non-geared reel, you really have to spin that thing to get it to reel back up.
If you've ever used both, you'll appreciate the geared reel, won't you? Yeah,
this stuff's not cheap. You can probably have to order it online because I don't know of any local stores that have it. Might be a few, but you're looking at more than $100 for a wire and a reel, but it's worth it, let me tell you. So you've got multiple reels perhaps, and you have a lot of versatility with this type of system. You can make any shape you want to, just about.
A question that I get frequently, John, is will this small, can you run that back out again? Will this small wire really keep cattle in?
And
can you speak to that?
So when I first got here, I had been using this system, and the old guy was moving off, had already sold his cattle, and he saw what I set up with this type of wire, and he said, that wire will never hold those cattle. And sure enough, it did.
Yes.
And I didn't have to invent it. Other people have proven that time and time again. You'd have to train them to it, that's for sure. If you just set this up with cattle, had never seen it, they would go under it, they'd go through it, they'd knock it down. There's not much to hold it together when you have these posts that just step into the ground. But once they learn to respect it, they're very respectful, and it doesn't even need to be energized every second of the day in order for them to stay in.
It does an amazing job of containing them, and well, that's what we're out here in the pasture right now, and that's what they're contained with here in this paddock that we're in right now. So we've talked about your type of grazing management. You're moving 2 or 3 times a day. That's definitely a management intensive rotational grazing system. You've covered your fencing that you use, and these step-in posts are extremely simple to use. You can put them just about anywhere, and you hook your wire in here, and you can walk off across this field and set up your paddock. The other thing that we need to mention, and you talked about this in your introduction, is the watering system. Can you talk to the watering system that you have here?
Yeah, it's important to have the water pretty close to the cattle. And by pretty close, I think the number might be 800 feet that they would have to walk to a water source. See, the difference is if they've got to walk a long way, they'll go as a herd, perhaps. They'll decide that, okay, it's time to get water. Everybody goes to get water. And that makes grazing a little more difficult because then you've got to have a pretty good water source. If you've got a large number of cattle drinking out of one water source, it's got to have a pretty good flow rate, recharge rate, and that might be more than your well pump could deliver. I like using well water here because we've got pretty good water, and the pump might only be 10 gallons per minute, but by running a pipeline on top of the ground with polypipe, I found it to work pretty well. We get water out to just about everywhere, and I use portable water troughs, 100-gallon size, maybe a little larger, with a float valve, so they stay full. Once you connect them up, you don't have to stand there and watch it.
So John, is this the tank that these cattle are watering out of now down over the hill there?
Exactly. So
you can't see the water line that's along that fence, but it's an above ground plastic water line that feeds that tank. Yeah. And that's the float that John's talking about. His 800 number is exactly right, and that if you look at research that Jim Garish did when he was at the University of Missouri, he showed exactly what John has already said here, that if you have that water in that 600 to 800 foot distance from the herd, they will go 2 or 3 at a time, and they can access that 100-gallon water tank and be fine. If they were going a half a mile, you would need a tank way bigger than that to be able to get everybody a drink, because what typically happens is the boss cows and your bull will get their drink, and then they'll leave, and the young stock, they're herd animals, so the young stock, they don't get a chance to drink, and they take off without having a drink, and that affects animal performance. So that's another thing that you want to look at. But yeah, you described the watering system to a T.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Cable, and to John for presenting on that. Wow, beautiful. You got some beautiful animals there, John. We're going to transition now to Paul. Paul Gross, Extension Soil Health Educator. And just remember, everyone, we're going to pause for some questions after this. And I see we have our poll results. So, Cable, I don't know if you want to touch on these real quick.
Yeah, I would like to speak to those really quick. It's
absolutely.
So, poll question number 1 looks like we have 91% know that you can increase utilization going from a continuous grazing system to a management intensive system, which is absolutely correct. That's awesome. We have a big percentage, well over half, 61% of our attendees today that actually know how many days they're currently grazing. So how do you know if the system is improving if you don't have certain things that you're measuring? And one of the easiest is, when did I start grazing? When did I stop? Boyd was talking about that earlier. John talks about that. We want to graze as many days as possible. So when we implement a new system, knowing where we were, having a baseline of where we were prior to implementing that system will help us measure any progress that we have. So yeah, it's good that you guys, you attendees, all of you know that that's an important thing. Again, that goes right into question 3. Why do we want to increase the number of grazing days? Because grazing is more cost effective than feeding mechanically harvested forage, period. Margins can be tight, especially in the beef cow-calf business, and we need to take advantage of those grazing days. And tons of benefits to moving daily, rest, recovery, all those mentioned. And so good, I'm good. Go ahead, Mr. Gross.
Hi, I'm Paul Gross. I'm an extension educator for field crops, cover crops, and soil health in Central Michigan. I've been associated with MSU for over 25 years. Last 10 years really focusing on cover crops and soil health and how to improve our soils, make them more resilient. We're standing out here on a pasture, and grazing systems are one way that we can really improve our soil health, improve productivity, improve the economics of livestock. And I think when we think about soil health and we think about the principles of soil health is we have living roots growing in the soil 365 days a year. And I think that's important to capture the sunlight through photosynthesis, and those sugars that are produced through photosynthesis are exudated out to those soil microbes through the roots, because you got livestock below the ground. As you can see, we got livestock above the ground. So we have to feed both of them all year long. And the second one is to keep the ground covered. The second principle, keeping the ground covered. When you look at a grazing system, you look at this particular field, when we got the heavy pasture grasses and legumes along with a good stocking rate, you know, we can keep the ground covered by how we manage our grazing. If we just kind of strip graze it off and take everything off the top, you know, we do have open bare soil if you overgraze this. And by having good growth, by having cattle that, you know, you're not going to graze all of this. John, the owner here, how often do you move these? What's your stocking rate in terms of taking off when you put this herd into?
Sure, it's not a super high density most times. I think there's a place for that, but in general, we're moving every day, and often 2 or 3 times a day. You know, for a herd this size right now, there's close to 170 animals with all the calves that have been born this year, 53 calves. You know, I'll give them probably at this time of year 5 to 10 acres a day. We're kind of getting our report card right now, being in the middle of September. Things that are, you know, kind of stalled out during the dry part of the year. We're seeing how good they're coming back or not coming back. And it looks pretty good.
Yeah.
But I could always hope for better, but it looks pretty good. We didn't take it down to nothing, so we've got something to grow on now that we've got good soil moisture again.
Yeah. So, and that's interesting, because I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. But, you know, the third principle of soil health is don't disturb. You know, disturb the soil as little as possible, and that means, you know, limiting tillage if you possibly can. In some production systems, it's a little harder, but in a grazing system, you wouldn't have to touch this. When was the last time this field saw a plow or a cultivator?
Well, it's probably at least 6 years, could be a little longer. I've been grazing it for 4 years, and it was already planted when I arrived here as a orchard grass alfalfa hayfield. So yeah, we're going on 6, 7 years probably.
Now, do you see any changes in how productive this pasture is?
I think it's gotten quite a bit better. It's pretty good. We might be having less alfalfa now than we used to, but that's the nature of alfalfa after being planted for that many years. I have seeded in red clover, and that's come in pretty nice in a number of places. Overall, I'm pretty happy with it.
Well, you know, that kind of segues into the fourth principle of soil health, is having a diversified plants growing. And you mentioned that diversified plants earlier on, because one of the things that we try to have is the diverse species, the different plant functions. We try to have grasses, we try to have legumes, and when we try to have a brassicas or a broadleaf. And the reason we do that, first of all, it creates some diversity in those microbial communities, but also gives you forage at different times. Because if you take warm season grasses and cool season grasses, warm and cool season legumes, it can provide you with that grazing, that forage throughout the year, that you're always looking to extend that grazing season. And having that diverse mix. The other thing it does, and I'd kind of like to just show that one of the things that I think is really interesting about when you're talking about soil health in any system, whether it's a grazing system or a conventional system, you have to dig. You know, the NRCS has a great quote, dig a little, learn a lot. Yeah. And I think this is a classic example of some of the things that we see. John talked about alfalfa, and we dug out this alfalfa plant that's probably been here as long as it's one of the first things planted. There's very few alfalfa out here, but alfalfa is a tap-rooted plant. So if you look at how this root structure is, apparently about 3 inches deep, there was a hard pan here. And so these roots, this taproot had to actually go around to get through. But over time, it made it through. So when we talk about plant diversity, we're also thinking about diversity of root structure. Those taprooted, like the alfalfa. The other one is like a red clover here. We can see the taproots of the red clover. And if you look close, you can see nodules. And that's what you want, those nitrogen producing nodules in your system. And then the other plant type that we want is our grasses. And this looks like to me some orchard grass.
Probably.
But look at what I like to look at and why I think grass is so great for soil health and building soil health. Look at the fibrous root system on this grass. And when you start looking at this fibrous root system, just think of the biomass that you're putting into the soil, how you're building up that organic matter, how you're putting that carbon back in. And when you see the fibrous roots, and this is the reason why we have the live roots, is for that rhizosphere effect, which I think is an important effect. And you can see, like even on these sands, when you look down with photosynthesis happening here, and the sugars going down here, and these small roots are exchanging those sugars for nutrients with those microbes, you start getting those soil glues, and you start building that aggregation. And that aggregation in the soil allows that pore space, it allows your pastures to hold water. When we get as our climate changes, as we get rain events that are very erratic, what type of rain patterns do we have here on your farm?
Yeah, it's variable, but we get dry spells in July and August, it seems like, and then it comes in strong after that sometimes. But yeah, you can get several inches of rain in one rain event. Mm-hmm. We saw that earlier this year. We're fortunate it's pretty sandy, and I think we've done a good job of not tearing anything up. It soaks in pretty good here.
I was going to say that was you had kind of answered the question. Is these larger rain events? Do you feel like because the way you're managing this pasture in these paddocks, you're taking and holding the water?
Yeah, I think so. I think it might keep going down because it's sand, but it definitely, it's not running off too far, I don't think.
Well, but when you got your tap-rooted, that's why you have those tap-rooted plants. So you can take those spring rains, those 2 or 3 inch events in the spring, we can hold it through those dry months in August, in July and August when we get really dry, really creating resilience in your system. So a grazing system is a real opportunity to improve soil health on farms, and it gives you an opportunity to get economic gain with cattle, improve your productivity of your soils and cattle. It's just a matter of remembering the principles, is keeping something growing, live roots 365 days a year, keep the ground covered like you do here, don't till like you've got, and have diversity of plants, which you have in this species. It just seems like this is just a really, really nice system you have, and it's probably only going to improve.
All right. So we have the results from, there it is, from Paul's poll.
Well, that's kind of interesting. I'm always interested in knowing, if people consider their soil to be healthy, and I see that over half of the people feel fairly comfortable with it. And the other question is do you feel like your soils are productive as they can be? And generally, we see that 89% say no. So, there's a lot of work that can be done to following some of these soil health principles to build our soils back. A lot of these farms over the period of time have had a little bit of soil degradation going on, and a grazing system and applying those principles is just a really good way to start building that productivity back in the soils. So.
Hey, Paul, quick, let's talk about a question that's on there that relates to exactly what you were just saying. So Bruce is asking, how might John at Baseline Farm increase grazing period, and reduce hay use. You just covered an increase in forage production. Go ahead and help with that.
Are you asking me the question, Cable?
Yeah, you were talking about that. I mean, John can weigh in. I can start actually. John talked about or moving from. John has been in a rotational grazing system, but as you move from continuous to a rotational grazing system, you will increase that grazing period. I have yet to see somebody that's went from a continuous system to a management intensive system that hasn't increased their grazing days. And as you increase the soil health, Paul, that's where I was bringing you into that. You produce more forage, you get better water infiltration.
Yeah.
The system produces more forage, you're rotating, it's resting, and the forage is recovering. You're grazing again, your grazing efficiency goes up.
I think one of the real key things that we can look at is water and water cycles. And, as we improve our soil health, our ability for our soils to take that water in and hold it, it makes more water available for our grass, our forage species. And, when we have those summer slumps, so to speak, and I'm looking at John's pastures, they really look really pretty good when we were out there for the time of year. So obviously things are going pretty well. But if we start building our soil health, and usually by that I always think in terms of, as we build organic matter in our systems, we improve the water holding capacity of those soils, and we improve that water cycle. And the more water, the more forage. And we can, again, as we mentioned in our discussion, we build resilience in our system, and that's really what we're looking to do.
I see a couple questions on water tanks, and John, I think this question was meant for you. Do you have dedicated portable troughs for each paddock for your operation, or do you move them around when they're empty?
Yeah, I move them. I have several so that I can kind of leapfrog and set up a new one without draining the old one. But maybe I have half a dozen different water troughs with float valves. I have a splitter, and sometimes I'll set up 2 water troughs in the same paddock, a little ways apart from each other, just to have more drinking area for the animals, especially when it's hot in the summer, and more storage capacity. As we get further out away from the well and the buildings, the flow rate dwindles, and it's maybe down to just a few gallons per minute at the very end of the line, which is manageable. But I've found you've got to have your water trough set up ahead of time before moving the cattle into the paddock, and let it fill. And then typically it doesn't run out, doesn't cause trouble. If you set an empty water trough in there, open the valve, and it's kind of trickling in, well, you'll get a bunch of cattle trying to drink out of it at the same time, and they'll start knocking it around, and then they'll flip it upside down, and then they won't have any water, and you'll have a big flood. So I've learned the hard way.
It sounds like you learned from experience.
Get it set up. But yeah, multiple ones. It's really not that expensive. I like the softer rubber ones, like the Rubbermaid ones that are stiffer. Wouldn't work the way I do it, because you saw the water trough kind of sitting in the middle of the cattle. A lot of people will put them under a fence line, which is not a bad idea. If you put it under a polywire fence line, cows will wag their tails and hook the fence, and horns hook the fence. So I like to set it right out in the middle, and if they step on it, it doesn't break anything. The harder Rubbermaid ones, I've had the connection, the bulkhead fitting break at the trough. But anyway, yeah.
Excellent. I just saw one as well. You want to talk briefly about your perimeter fence setup real quick?
Yeah, we're in the process of redoing it. The existing fence is pretty decrepit, just barbed wire and some remnants of woven wire. There's good woven wire along one roadway, and that's an okay way to do it, is to use a woven wire red brand style cattle fence, something like that. What I'm going to do is probably just 4-wire high tensile electric fence around the majority of the property as a perimeter fence. And you can look through the NRCS specs for Michigan. It'll tell you how frequently you need to place your post and the minimum number of wires. It depends, you know, if you have different class of animals than cattle, if you had sheep or something, you would probably want a different arrangement than just 4 wires. But yeah, I think high tensile wire is a good way to go for the ease of construction and just the cost. It's a lot less costly than even barbed wire or woven wire.
Awesome. And I know we have more questions, everyone, but I want to keep the presentation going. Well, there will be a question and answer session at the end of the field day, so be sure to stick around for that. We'll try to answer some questions as well as we move along by typing. So we might not address them live, so keep an eye out for that. I want to transition to Jason Roundtree. Jason was not able to join us here today, so he recorded his presentation. And we also have a recorded question and answer session for him as well. So he's going to talk about soil health in our, or actually he's going to discuss regenerative agriculture and carbon sequestration, and again, answer some questions from a panel. So let's get to Jason's presentation here.
Well, hello, and thank you for the opportunity to be able to let me share some information about our research center with you. I'm sorry I can't be there today. My name is Jason Roundtree. Again, I'm an associate faculty member in animal science, where a majority of our work is done at Lake City Research Center. We've been working on grazing systems for about the last 10 to 11 years. And I'd like to just share some data with you guys, kind of give you the ethos of our approach, and also maybe share a few thoughts on where I think we're headed. I'm certainly excited to be able to also engage Paul and John on this. And so I'll go to my slides here and just really kind of want to briefly, as many of you know and read the news and whatever, you see that there's just always this epic debate, right? Like there's these challenges of, do cattle help or hurt the environment? And even when you start looking at it in the scientific world, there's not consensus. For instance, I can go to the literature, and we use what's called holistic planned grazing, a methodology that's based on trying to graze in a way that's improving the environment. And you can go to the science and find some people suggest that holistic planned grazing doesn't do much, that we should just throw the cattle out and really lowly manage them. There's also people that would argue that enteric methane is a key contributor to climate change, and therefore reducing livestock dramatically will improve society. And finally, as we know, this concept of grazing livestock and soil carbon and the potential maybe to offset some CO2 emissions through grazing, even if we can do those things, people would suggest in the literature and science that it isn't a long-term possibility. But concurrently, I can also go to the literature and find papers that support the opportunities of planned grazing and animals' positive impacts on land, that indeed grazing does sequester significant carbon. I can find papers out there, plus from our laboratory at Michigan State, that would suggest that methane is kind of down the line when looking at emissions in a beef cattle model, a grazing model specifically. And finally, that we've lost so much carbon because of poor agricultural management, that indeed there's a great opportunity to use regenerative agriculture to regenerate that carbon from the atmosphere and put it back into the soil. As you're learning in this school about managed grazing, we use in the literature a term called adaptive multi-paddock grazing, which effectively is kind of an overarching term for planning your grazing. We've got John and on here who's we've worked with for a long time that's been applying this. And what we found through this management protocol at Lake City is that we actually see greater cattle productivity by our management. We hypothesize this is the fact that we can typically see grasses in a more vegetative way, and therefore they're more nutritious and the cattle can perform well. We have to acknowledge that in any grazing system, there is methane that goes off. We also have more and more information and science to support the fact that as we manage this way, we begin to see greater plant productivity from a standpoint of more leaf area, but likewise, those roots, those plants' roots are putting down deeper, they're broader. And what this does then is it reduces soil erosion, and it's also increasing microbial activity in the soil. Because of those things, we're seeing greater soil carbon sequestration. This has to do somewhat from the litter and the root turn, or the litter and the plant being incorporated into the ground, but more so based on what's going on below ground, the greater microbial activity, the greater processing of materials into carbon that's bound to mineral. And the thing I also wanted to point out is that it's really predicated on a recovery period and allowing plants to fully recover, which for us means we don't want a plant to be grazed more than once over a 3-day period. So we at maximum allow animals to graze plants for around 3 days, and then we want to allow for those plants to come into a full recovery. So the first study I would like to share with you is a study that we did. It was published in Agriculture Systems that actually looked at our on-farm grass-fed model. We measured emissions, we looked at carcass weights, and what we decided to do was to take this and compare it to a grain-fed scenario. I don't really have a contention on grain versus grass, but we use that as a contrast. We also incorporated 5 years of soil carbon sequestration into this model to look at the potential for offsets in our grass finishing system. And just quickly, what we found is that when we looked at all the emissions, meaning all the greenhouse gases going up from that system, we found that many as others that a feedlot finishing system is pretty efficient. It's more efficient than an adaptive multi-paddock or our grass finishing system by about 30 to 40%. But what I also want to share is when you go to the literature, when we compared our grazing system to continuous set stock grazing, we found that our emissions were 45% lower than what has originally been reported in the literature. We had considerably shorter grass finishing times for the beef. In fact, relative to some papers, 6 to 8 months shorter. We hypothesize this is due to our greater forage quality and our pasture fertilization. And so just to think about this in a figurative way, here's the different emissions. And again, we're thinking about the enteric methane emissions from feed and manure that are going up, the adaptive multi-paddock on the left, a feedlot on the right. The greatest footprint is the methane. Typically in a grain-fed scenario, it's going to be more of the feed emissions. But you can see that 30% or so decrease in the feedlot. But here's something that's really interesting I want to show you. So if I look at that footprint and I don't incorporate the changes in soil carbon, this is what those numbers look like on a kilogram of beef from an emission perspective. If I incorporate soil carbon sequestration in the model, our actual grass finishing system became a net sink to the environment. And so importantly, it's good to understand that through proper management, we may be able to even manage our cattle and produce beef while supplying a net sink of carbon back into the soil through our management system. Now, nothing's perfect and nothing's easy in these systems. And for instance, in this situation, it takes considerably more land to have a grass finishing model as compared to a grain model. In fact, it can take 2 to 2.5 times the amount of land, and that's something that's really important to understand. And so at the end of the day, we found that our grazing at Lake City actually has been a sink to the environment. If we were to incorporate the cow footprint, that would be less of a benefit just to the grass finishing. But regardless, we know that what we're doing is building soil carbon in that system. It's important, though, when you think about this big picture, that you understand the differences in land use. And we do, however, hypothesize and summarize without question that grazed cattle do definitely have a role to play in sustainable food systems. The other thing that we talked about earlier is what is the impact of methane? This is from a brand new paper that we had published in Applied Animal, Animal Ag Systems. And what I want to say is that methane for a very long period of time has been a natural cycle, a natural system with grazing animals and the ecological environments they're in, going back to bison or many other natural migrating ruminants that are out there. And so it's important to understand that when cattle graze, they process forages, and those forages are used for nutrients for production. But likewise, we do see methane coming up, and it is erupted out into the environment. when you hear the term cow farts or all some of those things out of other areas, it's important to understand that 98% of the methane emitted is through the mouth and only a couple percent through the back end. But it's important to understand, though, that when cattle bring methane up into the environment, it is broken down in about a 10 to 12 year window by OH radicals. And so it's effectively what happens is that this CH4 is broken down into water and carbon dioxide, which is then used in terms of rain events and to regenerate in terms of photosynthesis. And so often we have situations where cattle are just blamed for all these problems in the environment. But it's important to understand that methane has been a natural, very long ongoing system, and nature has found a way to balance that out. And so it's important to understand that when people begin to really get on beef cattle and dairy cattle based on the standpoint of methane. This is the way that we measure methane. This is actually a green feed monitoring system where a cow can actually come in and we actually bait some pellets. She comes in and grazes, eats these pellets in this hopper, and we can actually measure the amount of methane that's going into that system. And so we've been doing this for a very long number of years now. And it's important to understand that most of our data would suggest that based on the normal predictive equations used to look at cattle's impact, we've actually found that our cattle have normally 15 up to even in some situations 30% less methane than what the textbooks say they should. And it goes back to management again. And so I think it's important to understand that methane is a natural part of the system. It isn't something that we should believe is destroying the earth through climate. And now methane from other sources can certainly be more problematic. But I think when you talk about methane in the context of ecology, it's certainly not the problem that many people make it out to be. The last couple things I'd like to show with you is some data that we've been working on. We've almost got this paper accepted, so I feel good about sharing it with you. A paper that I've done working with White Oak Pastures in Georgia on looking at the impacts of management, again, on ecosystem services. So in 1993, this is what White Oak Pastures looked like. It was a crop farm, highly eroded. And what the manager began to do, the landowner, is he began to bring in cattle. He began and hogs and poultry and create this stacked enterprise model to begin to regenerate the land. So he's using managed grazing. He uses compost. He brings hay onto the farm to feed it. But it's really a neat success story showing the impacts of animal science on improved land. And so what we did is we went in working with General Mills, a company called Qantas, and we sampled across the transition time. So we did what's called a chrono sequence. Year 0, 5, 10, 15, and 20. So this was all done at one time. So effectively, what we did is we went into some areas that had been managed regeneratively just for a couple years, all the way up to 20 years, if that makes sense. And so what we found is that over that entire period of time through this chrono sequence is that the manager was enjoying about a 2.3 metric ton of carbon sequestration per year. When we looked at different soil health parameters across that time, water stable aggregate, microbial respiration, active carbon, and soil protein, we found that every year that he managed, those numbers went up. Interestingly, we didn't see as solid of a water holding capacity as I would have thought. But the point being is that through this period of time, we saw dramatic and positive improvements in soil health and soil carbon sequestration. Another thing I would like to kind of begin to finish up with here is the aspect of soil carbon stabilization. Many people think that carbon sequesters very quickly, and this is some brand new work in Nature looking at the impacts of soil carbon saturation and organic matter. And what I want you to understand is this is blue is grasslands, red is forests, and this is what we call mineral associated organic matter, or the carbon bound to mineral that's very stable in the soil. And what this was done over thousands of samples from Europe. And what the scientists showed is that there can be saturation of carbon, but it happens at very high amounts, such that only at about 10 to 12% organic matter do we actually begin to see the saturation of carbon in the soil. If we look at particulate organic matter, which is that bigger aggregate that we see in the soil, there's absolutely no saturation whatsoever. So what this says is that we should manage and can consider the management of regenerative agriculture and its ability to potentially offset carbon emissions as a long-term goal and a long-term solution, I think, to helping mitigate climate. And so just some top-end opportunities, another paper in Nature written by Keith Poskian, that he summarizes that through a combination of crops, grasslands, management, plus technology, that if we look at the opportunities of agriculture over time, we have a really keen opportunity to be able to use regenerative agriculture to offset CO2 emissions. And I think that's something very important to document as we move forward. And so what does that look like? How do we do this and how do we see this come to fruition? Well, that's what we're working on here, is what type of monitoring and calibration can we generate to begin to understand what's happening with water, with carbon, with biodiversity, and to be able to do hardcore measurements at the ground level, but also link this stuff into remote sensing. And that's kind of where we're headed at Lake City, working on the aspects of measuring metrics and monitoring, and being able to generate opportunities to understand what's happening at the ground, linking it up to space, but then likewise using algorithms that are predictive of soil carbon, water infiltration, and then bring that back to a farmer's hands through technology. And so that's really where I see this headed. And so I think there's some unique opportunities that are out there. There's some new opportunities through ecosystem service markets, through Indigo Ag and others that are looking at these opportunities. And so with that, I want you to be aware that while we talk a lot about carbon, it is only one metric. Biodiversity, water, animal productivity, there's a lot of things out there we need to keep in mind of. I do believe that the change can happen and happen soon. I think that we're going to have to see these markets evolve over time to where they are going to more aptly monetize the farmer and rancher as these things go on. And I think it's important, though, that we need to be really working to address how can we adopt agriculture management that is going to help in terms of climate, but likewise be profitable in the process. So with that, I'll stop and you know, we can begin to have a discussion. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank Dr. Roundtree for taking the time to talk to us today and share the research that he's been working on over the past several years. I do see tons of benefit when it comes to the grazing animal, and that's good on a grazing virtual field day. So Jason, thank you for taking the time today to share this information with you, and I'm going to move into some questions. I'm sure we have some questions from those attending.
Well, if you don't mind me going first, Jason, a lot of discussion about how we pay for the carbon credits. You know, there's some discussion about paying for the actual carbon credits or paying producers for the actual practice. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. And as this industry is growing, there's multiple strategies that have been ongoing. Excuse me. Life in Zoom, guys. So the way that I look at this is there are some strategies that are what I call check the box action strategies, like quit tilling, improve biodiversity, reduce fertilizers. And if you check those boxes, then we're going to assume there is some benefit. Others are merely outcome driven, such that they don't really care about the action you do. They just want to see, is carbon building or not? And it's much easier to do a check the box versus actually get out there and measure the outcome. What's going to happen, I think, for a system to truly evolve, where we're treating a ecosystem service, or what marketing natural capital, is we're going to have to see the system evolve a lot. Generally speaking, there's 3 rules to natural capital. Number 1, there has to be a felt need for it. I think we're evolving into that. We understand we've got to improve our carbon and get it out of the atmosphere. We got to keep water clean. Number two is that the benefit, like the cost the farmer, the premium has to be considerably greater. And so what happens then is that if you think about the oil industry today, Paul, if we were to price oil at $60, it takes 6 to 7 barrels of oil to make a ton of carbon. So effectively, we're paying one entity $400 to bring carbon out of the ground. Today's carbon markets for farmers is only about $14 or $15. So you've got $400 versus $15, and it's going to be really, so effectively, I'm not saying we should compare it to oil, but we need to pay the farmers a lot more, in my opinion, to see this market become more robust. And I think when it happens, I really believe it can be a true aspect to help regenerate, our local communities also.
So Jason, when we're talking about carbon and selling those carbon credits, I had the opportunity to listen to a podcast recently where they were, the speaker was Dr. Terry McCosker from Australia. You probably know him in your circles, maybe. He was talking about the carbon buying program, the carbon credits program that they have here, that they have there in the Australia. How long before we're at that point here in the U.S.?
We're here now. I mean, we're here now, but it's just so immature. And I think we're going to begin to see it grow. There's several acts right now in Congress. One of which is coming through the House is the Resilient Agriculture Act that is basically wanting to begin more monetization of practices, Paul, that help improve ecosystem function. Our Senator Debbie Stabenow is concurrently working on things. The main, as I talked, Ecosystem Service Market Consortium is a growing entity of bigger companies that is looking to potentially monetize this. I can also say that there's many people out there that are just waiting on this market, and as it grows, I think it can happen, but it's going to be tough. I mean, we have to be able to measure it well, and I think that's where us as a university can really try to contribute to seeing this evolve. And the last thing I'm going to say is, man, my heart's for the farm. It's for rural agriculture in rural America. And I don't want to see this as a way of extracting money out of our rural areas such that farmers are underpaid for the things they're doing. I talked about 14 versus 15 bucks. So I think we have to be very careful that we protect the farmer's opportunity to take advantage of this. I think about cooperatives and think of other strategies that really can benefit our rural communities.
So Jason, from a producer standpoint, I guess a couple of questions. I think the concepts that you're talking about are really good. My question is, from a cash crop farmer, if there's somebody who says, hey, I want to participate in this, what would be his next step? And then as well, a grazer, what would be the next step for an individual grazer to be part of this effort?
Sure, that's a great question. So, I think the first thing that's going to have is there are entities now today, I mean, that are potentially brokering. I think, Indigo Ag, Paul, you and I have talked about Indigo before. They're out there today. I mean, you can reach out to them today. I just don't know. Nori is another entity that are out there today. But when you look at the cost benefit analysis, that's the problem, in my opinion, right? Where if you look at a general mean subsidy or mean payment that's going into crop systems today, I think the median is around 50 some odd bucks an acre. So I don't envision seeing these dramatic changes in soil carbon per acre happening quickly over, there has to be a really cascading set of actions to improve carbon. We've got, going from till to no till. improving with cover crops, adding animals into those scenarios. All these tools have to be stacked up and concurrently dramatically lowering or even eliminating nitrogen fertilizer. And so I think, John, what you sparked in me is that probably we're going to continue to need to meet and to educate and move forward in that space, I think, before we see a lot of this happening. So to answer your question, there are markets out there currently. As I indicate, I don't think that they pay the farmers enough. And I think, also understanding what actions are necessary to put yourself in a place to be able to generate those ecosystem services also.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks. I guess one lead-on question from there is, when I go and talk to a landlord, and that landlord is debating around non-regenerative ag versus regenerative ag, what is the benefit picture? I guess it almost has come down to dollar and cents that I can present to that person by using regenerative ag practices on their land.
Great. Well, if we look at much of the data out there, anywhere from 30 up to 70% based on the papers you look at, 30 to 70% of our soil carbon, our soil's gone through erosion, right? And if you monetize that, if you think about that as a wealth to society, that's a huge loss. It's unbelievable. And so to me, the opportunities to help build that back, to leave your children and grandchildren something better for their future, more resilient for their future, to me is a win-win. We know the tools, we know the actions. It's now time to put it we know the tools, it's time to put it into action. And so my thoughts would be that if you care about clean water, if you care about leaving your farm or leaving society in a better place, these, in my opinion, should be win-wins for the farmer, for the landowner, for society. So that's kind of the way I would frame it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So I got a question. I'm not quite sure how to answer it, Jason, but at the farm level, as a farmer starts implementing some of these regenerative practices to improve soil health, does your research show that they're getting that economic benefit by higher productivity, better grass, better resilience in their pastures in fluctuating climate? Is that an incentive to move down that path to position themselves for when some of these credits or incentives might be ready out there for people?
Yeah, great question. I mean, that's the bottom line, right? And what we found at Lake City is that when I inherited the farm 10 plus years ago, we weren't doing anything wrong. We were just doing everything pretty conventionally. So we eliminated fertilizers except for some cover crops. We quit cutting hay. We do buy hay and bring it on the farm. We dramatically reduced our cow size, which has probably been as beneficial as anything in that piece. But what I want to say is that we dramatically lowered our costs in that scenario, and we concurrently increased our productivity 30 to 40% per unit land. And so we lowered our costs, we managed better, and we've seen a 30 to 40% increase on our overutilization per acre per year at Lake City over 10 years. And so the question then is that, would you rather implement these technologies or go out and try to find 30 to 40% more land and do the same thing? And so you think about it from a cost scenario, it's a no-brainer. And I feel comfortable with our data. And listen, I work every day with farmers here, nationally and globally, that all will point to it. And so we know that in agriculture, often costs are the primary driver to profitability, not income. And so what we've been able to do is dramatically lower our costs and increase productivity in a natural way that's also improving the function of the ecology of the system. So I think there's a lot of opportunities out there, and that's probably going to be the biggest driver at the end of the day, Paul, is that issue of profitability above and beyond any promised payment for doing an action or generating an outcome. And I feel good about the data that we have over the years to show that.
I think we're well beyond the time that we need for questions, but I do have one other question, just as a point of curiosity to me, and to build on what Paul asked. is there a limit to how much organic matter you can build in the soil? Does the soil have a point where it reaches a certain level and can't sequester any more carbon or organic?
That's such a key question, and that's you know what I think Francesca Catrufo's paper in Nature brings out, and what she's showing is that there can be saturation. There's only so much mineral. So how is carbon stored in soil, right? Well, we've got litter's knocked over. It's processed. It's brought into the ground. But the key driver is that the root matter, the exudates, that carbon that's there is tied to mineral through microbial processing. So there's certain families of microbes that take the carbon and bind it to mineral, and that mineral is the stable component of organic matter. It's smaller. We call it mineral associated organic matter, and it can saturate, but it normally doesn't saturate till over 10% organic matter. And I've been here 10 years, and I don't know outside of muck ground if I've seen anybody's organic matter that high. I mean, if we get over 5, I'm pretty delighted. And so point being is there's a lot of opportunity out there. But let's say even if you are the best in the world and you do see it begin to saturate, we know that particular organic matter, which is that larger aggregate bound to roots, that particular organic matter continues to grow over time. It's just more labile. You have to work harder to protect it, right? So the point then is that really, I don't see an end to this in our lifetime for sure, because all of our soils are so degraded that there's so much opportunity out there. I don't see it happening anytime soon. And if it did, hallelujah, we've done our job. And I think we'll leave the world a lot better place than what we found it.
Well, Jason, again, I just want to thank you for taking the time to speak to us today. I do appreciate the information that you bring to the table, and I do appreciate all the work that you're doing for us here regionally in the state of Michigan and around the Great Lakes, as well as throughout this country and globally, as you have mentioned. Again, thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.
I'd just like to thank Paul and John. And I mean, John has been such a great component of our program. I met John 10 years ago, and he's been wonderful to work with. And I'd love to see how his farm has grown. And now it's multi-generational, and likewise working with Paul over the years as well. And Cable, I won't say anything about you, buddy.
All right. I think that was definitely informational. Since it was pre-recorded, it's the second time I watched it, and just a lot of good information in that presentation. I hope you all got something out of that and learned a little bit about regenerative ag. So we're going to get to questions here pretty shortly. So I see we got a good half dozen to get to, but I do have some announcements and some resources I want to go over with you all, so you can access those. So here we have additional resources, how you can contact some of our experts. Obviously, John Cox there, Baseline Farms. You can look up my information at washtenaw.cd.org. You got Roundtree and Thurlow and Gross there, Adam Shedd and Boyd. You can email any of us, and I see you got our contact info also in the chat here also. As well as some other resources about foraging, it looks like. And yes, we need your feedback as well. There will be a post-survey questionnaire sent out to all of you. So we would really appreciate your information. It helps us do our jobs better. This unfortunately seems like something we'll be doing for the foreseeable future in lieu of in-person field days. They'll be more virtual for the time being anyways. So we appreciate your feedback so we know where we can improve and hopefully make this even better in the future. Just want to promote something real quick about our conservation district, you can always sign up to our newsletter by visiting our website, washtenaw.cd.org. And if you want, native trees and plants, that's a great way to go. We have seedlings for sale every spring and fall. And if you're not in our county, you can definitely look up your county's conservation district. Just enter into Google, and I'm sure something will lead you to your conservation district in your area. Everyone, we'd like to really thank you for joining us on behalf of the Washtenaw County Conservation District and Michigan State University. We really appreciate it. I wanted to give just a special thanks to Megan, Dave, and Alex for helping us all out. They're working behind the scenes. They've been working behind the scenes, and a lot of these guys herd cattle, but they really were herding cats, these three. So especially Megan, thank you very much for that, keeping us all in line. So again, check out those resources and email us if you'd like. Fill out that phase 1 form for MEAP. You can email that to myself or your local technician, and that will count for your MEAP credit. That's all I've got in terms of announcements. I'm sure if anyone has anything else as far as the panelists go, they'll plug it. And right now, let's get to some questions. All right. This one we'll start with John, but I know several of you have cattle, and I'm sure you all kind of deal with the winter a bit differently. So how do you manage the herd in winter and early spring when the ground is soft? And do you continue to rotate the herd on pasture, or do you limit their movement to a certain field? So we'll start with John, but I think anyone can comment on this one. You're muted, John. Oh, no.
So we feed hay out on the pasture. Don't move the fence and rotate around quite as often as in the summer, but I try to spread it out so that I'm not feeding hay on top of hay and making a big buildup. It's pretty sandy here, sandy and gravelly even, so we don't have the trouble that a lot of folks might have if they had heavier ground. It gets a little tore up, but in general, we're pretty good. And you can kind of be strategic about how you're going to move your round bales around. You could put them out right now and maybe just bale graze them without unrolling them. That's an option. I typically unroll them, but sometimes it's a combination of both, having bales sit out there and then unrolling some that are nicer ones. It's going to get tore up to a certain extent, but you hope that with rest, the spots that do get damaged will heal, and they do.
So just to add to that, Nick, quickly, absolutely agree with everything that John said. Up in our area, we tend to have heavier soils, and there are going to be certain times of the year when you're going to have to get those animals off because you will do some damage. But if you're doing a good job of managing, you can bale graze when the ground's frozen, and in the spring when it starts to thaw out, you move them to your sacrifice slot.
Excellent. Anyone else want to comment on what they do in the winter, or I think we covered that pretty.
I'll make a quick comment because a lot of people ask me about bale rings and stuff like that, or feeders, and I don't use any of that. It's just hay on the ground. And yeah, you can definitely waste more theoretically when it's wet. On frozen ground, you really don't waste much at all. But before you think about all this, buying a bunch of bale rings and feeders and stuff, try to run through the math of how much those things cost, and they'll get tore up eventually, and how long they're going to last. You're going to get a lot more compaction and tearing up if you have even a big feed wagon that you can put round bales in. All the cattle standing in one spot. You've really got to consider the bunk space. If you have a lot of cattle like I do, where you're feeding them all at once and not separating into too many different herds during the winter, they've all got to eat at the same time. So rolling out bales seems to work pretty good to satisfy that requirement.
Hey, John, quick question on the rolling out bales. So how often do you do that?
Pretty much every day during the winter. And that's just kind of to manage my time. Like you could roll some out ahead of time if the weather was good for that. But yeah, typically go out there and roll them out generally by hand. There's a lot of fancy stuff you can try to get to roll them out, but with the aid of a little bit of a slope and knowing which way it's going to unroll, you can get them out there without too much real trouble.
I'm sure with your engineering degree, you know how many feet are in the bale and how far you are away from the perimeter fence.
Well, I'll tell you what, you know, a lot of people make hay, but a lot of people don't unroll the bales and look at what it came out like. So you can really see the differences, thinner windrow, a thicker windrow, whether they weaved and got thin spots on one side or the other. And sometimes you'll find some interesting stuff in there, trash or whatnot, but also I've all kinds of things.
Yeah, and just to touch on the feeders versus rolling them out, from a MEAP standpoint, I'm looking for rotation with where you feed them and where you water your cattle. So I think what John's got, you know, that's a simple system, and he doesn't have to deal with hauling the feeders around anymore, and he avoids compaction. You know, he rolls one bale out in one area and the next day rolls one out in another area, and really spreads them out, especially in the winter and the spring where things can get a bit messy. Someone asked, what is your favorite perennial grass to no-till in and why? I'm assuming that maybe they're referring to what grass is best in pasture.
Sure. Well, I think it really depends on your soil type to a degree. Being as sandy as we are here, I see orchard grass growing real well. I've planted some fescue, tall fescue improved varieties. Seem to do okay. It's kind of hard to tell until it goes to seed, which you try not to let it go to seed. So people recommend ryegrass. I haven't seen a lot of success with ryegrass, but it really depends. If you had heavier clay type of ground, you might do well with that. I planted pretty broad mixtures when I selected the seeding mix originally, and it's a little bit hard to tell what took and what didn't. It's done well enough that I think that worked, but to just, you know, throw out some names there, you're going to want to look at local seed companies, what's available locally. You know, if it works in Missouri, it might not work that well here. Kind of check with Extension and try things.
Yeah, I think it definitely varies based on, like you said, soil type and condition, and there's a lot of factors. There's no right answer, I guess. Generally speaking, is core or spike aeration cost effective on pasture land? Anyone want to tackle that one?
I don't have any experience trying, but you know, I don't know. You could do a lot of things, but I think if you've maybe after you've optimized your fencing and rotation and grazing management and mineral program and everything else, and then you decide that you might want to do some type of mechanical aeration, maybe it would help.
I'm going to say it's possible, Nick, but you know, I know of a producer that bought a spike aeration tool, pretty good size one, and spent a fair amount of money on it, probably 15 years ago. And I think it's been 14 years since I've seen it out of his shed. I'm just saying that you can do more with the management, I think, that John's employing on his farm, and increase the soil health that Mr. Gross talked about today. That'll take care of some of those. You know, why are we going to use a spike aerator in the first place? And I think about compaction. There are other ways that I can address compaction versus spending thousands of dollars on a piece of equipment.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Someone asked, are land-grant universities now teaching regenerative ag practices and systems in their agricultural colleges?
I'm going to step out and say, well, you just heard from Dr. Roundtree, and Dr. Roundtree works for MSU. He's a professor in the animal science department. Yeah, he's teaching regenerative ag practices and has been since he's been here. There are other professors that Paul and I work with on a regular basis that also are moving into teaching regenerative ag practices. Paul?
I would agree. I think that we're seeing more and more of it. I know Dr. Roundtree is the one that's kind of been first to dip his toe in the pool, and I think there's a lot of followers that are moving along as growers become more interested in those type of practices. They're doing the research to support.
I guess as sort of a follow-up, are you seeing, I guess, a majority of land-grant universities going that route, or is it still nascent in that regard?
I think, boy, that's a really good question, but it's kind of a hard question. I think they're just starting. A lot of the land grants are just starting. Some are much further along than others. That have. Sometimes it depends on the faculty and the researchers and what their interests are, which kind of drives some of the direction that some of those departments are heading. But yeah, I think MSU is really, I would say that I'm not sure they're the leader, but I think they're one of one of the land grants in the country that are really doing research and teaching on regenerative ag. Cable?
And Paul, I would say that our leadership administration at the university is standing behind that and helping these professors like Jason, these researchers, be successful. So to me, that speaks a lot also. They wouldn't be able to do the research and the work that they're doing if they didn't have the support of their administration.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Someone asked, as he moves cattle to each new paddock, he moves tubs around, but how does he reconnect to the water source to fill the next tub? John, do you want to go into a little bit more
Sure.
detail?
Yeah, that's not a hard question. Imagine, in your house, you have different spigots. You have a bathroom sink and a kitchen sink. Well, I've got water pipe on top of the ground, usually under a fence line, spread throughout the whole farm, a mile of pipe, more than a mile. And it has different spigots at different points in the different pastures. So it's really just opening a valve and physically connecting the hose, a garden type hose, to that valve that runs to the water trough. The fittings I use, you could use garden hose fittings, but then you'll have to thread them on there each time, and that can get a little tricky, especially when it's cold or dirty or whatever. There's different stuff out there. You can get kind of the fancy snap-in connectors through the grazing supply stores. What I ended up doing is just using cam lock fittings. You find them in the sprayer section of Tractor Supply or a store like that. So it's a cam lock fitting that snaps together and locks, open up a valve, 90-degree ball valve, water's flowing. And then when I want to drain the trough, I would disconnect, turn off the valve on my water pipeline, disconnect the hose. With the Job float valves that I use, it's a quarter turn. You take the valve out of there and the water flows back through the hose that it flowed into, so you can drain out your trough. If you've ever tried to dump 100 gallons of water out of a full trough, you'll realize it's not so easy to just pick that up and dump it. But yeah, and that's the basics of it, to actually physically move the water trough around. They're pretty heavy. You're not going to want to carry it very far or drag it very far. So you could use a little trailer with an ATV, or for a while I used my pickup truck. Lately we've got a nice little side-by-side that we're borrowing, and that works great. Throw it in the bed of that and drive around.
yeah, you could use a little trailer, whatever.
Excellent. And we have a question here. Would native pasture or grass species be effective in terms of animal performance and carbon sequestration? Maybe we can talk a little bit about the animal performance. I know Jason would probably be more suited to answer the sequestration part. But
Well,
any comment?
Depends. You know, if you've got CRP ground that you're just grazing for the first time in 10 years, no matter what species you got in there, it's probably not going to be quite as high test as you might hope for. But with good grazing management, I think if you knocked it down and let it grow back, the species should be fine. We have on the farm 10 acres of native warm season tall grass prairie. Bought the seed mix, planted it about 4 years ago, and it's really taken until this year to really look like it's productive. But the cattle love it. You know, big blue stem, little blue stem, switchgrass. Those are some of the main grass species that you see out there. And we kind of try to manage it so that they're not tearing it up and grazing it down too far, but it's similar to other pastures. You can rotate through it, and the forage seems pretty palatable to the cattle.
Awesome. Got plenty of comments here. You know, thank you, John. John, they're very impressed with your work, and everyone with the presentation. Great job. One, I forgot to say thank you specifically to John's cattle, who were extremely cooperative throughout the whole process and allowed us to, you know, get in there, right in there with them. And that was a lot of fun. That was very interesting. So that was fun. I don't see any more questions. Cable, I know you answered quite a few as presentations were going on. So thank you very much. Folks may want to check those out. You may have a similar question.
I feel like I just took a final exam. There's lots of participation by our participants today. It's lots of questions. Yeah. It's great.
And several of them I recognize. So it's great to see a lot of local folks really attending in and wanting to know more about this. So thank you all for attending. There's no more questions. I don't know if you guys have questions for each other, but I think we can wrap this up.
No questions on my end, Nick, but first of all, thank you for working with us. When I say us, I'm talking MSU and Washtenaw County. Thank you for working with us to host this field day. John, thank you for letting us tour your farm and you know, you kind of opened the doors and just showed everybody what's going on. I think you're doing some great things on your farm. The virtual day went well. And again, I just want to thank everybody for attending and thank the team. You've already mentioned the folks behind the scenes, Megan and Dave, that are keeping us on track and making it all look good. I do appreciate that. And just, you know, if you have any questions that we didn't answer, we're going to be around hopefully after today. So please feel free to reach out to us and we'll get back to you and help you in any way that we can. So I'm going to mute here and let the rest of you talk, but thanks and hope everybody has a great day.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, John. When I've wanted to do a field day in the midst of all this, you know, John was one of the first people I thought of, and he was very agreeable to doing it. We wanted to do it in person, and obviously we thought that maybe that wouldn't be feasible. So when I saw, I believe, Extension's manure field day, I immediately tried to contact MSU for guidance into how do we do this online virtually. And you guys have been great to work with. Again, thank you, John. Thank you, Adam, for coming in as well and explaining grazing management. And if anyone is interested in grazing management plans or other plans, definitely contact Adam Shedd. And thank you all once again for attending here today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.